Hi everyone, thanks for attending virtually to this presentation. It's my first time attending and presenting at DjangoCon. I'm really excited to be here and I'm grateful for this opportunity. Before I start, I would like to ask a couple of questions. Are you watching this presentation because you just started learning Django? Have you tried the official Django Pulse tutorial and had no idea what was going on? To introduce myself, my name is Andrew Kim and I'm not a professional web developer. I actually work in the building and construction industry as a project manager. Today I'm going to talk about how I started learning Django and my journey into the deep world of web development as someone not from the tech industry. So if you're just starting to learn Django, I hope that this presentation will give you some tips to help you on your journey. This is my backstory. I moved to Melbourne early this year, and when the pandemic hit, I was made redundant. I was unemployed for a couple of months. I was stuck at home, having a career existential crisis, and I was thinking about all the crappy and super expensive software that I was using for project management. I thought, how about I build something myself? And so the journey began. I decided to build project management software specifically for client-side project managers and architects in the building and construction industry. And when I decided to learn web development, I thought, because I know HTML and CSS, I've made a couple of WordPress websites here and there, that web development will be easy for me. And so I installed Django and I tried the official Django Pulse tutorial. It took me 4 days to get through it, and in the end, I still had no idea what was going on. So my first advice is this. The journey to web development is long, but very well traveled. To be honest, I underestimated how complex it is to learn web development. Maybe you know some HTML, CSS, maybe you can make some WordPress websites, but backend web development is a whole different level. It's complex, it is constantly changing. So don't expect to learn Django overnight. It's going to take you months and months. But the good news is that this is a road that many people have already taken. If you're feeling frustrated and confused, take comfort that you are not alone. Many people would have felt the same way when they started. Learning web development just takes time, and you just need to keep going. Tip number 2, Django is a good choice. So you decided to undertake the journey, and you realize there are so many programming languages and frameworks out there. So what language or framework should you choose? There's Django, Ruby on Rails, Node.js, and there are front-end frameworks like React, Angular, and the list goes on. When I started, I spent some time researching different tech stacks out there, and I just ended up choosing Django because the tagline really resonated with me. The web framework for perfectionists with deadline. And I'm glad I chose Django. Django has been a great choice. And it could be a great choice for you too. Django is open source, meaning it's built and maintained by volunteers. So you can install it for free and get going straight away. Like this kind of concept of open source is mind-blowing as someone coming from a building and construction industry where you're kind of expected to pay for any kind of resources. It is a mature framework. It's been tried and tested with many websites. It provides good security protection out of the box. It has a large community. This is important because it means Django is more likely to be supported in the future, and there are a lot of resources and people out there who can help you. It's also built on Python, which is a very popular language for beginners. It's clean and readable. When you're developing Django, it's kind of expected that you know a little bit of Python. I personally don't think you need to be an expert, but I do recommend spending a couple of days learning Python. I did the free Codecamp tutorial, Python tutorial on YouTube, and I found that very useful. So maybe you can check that out. By the way, I'll be putting the slides on my website with links to all the resources that I mentioned in this presentation. Tip number 3, have a project in mind. You decided to learn web development and decided that Django is a great choice and you did some Python tutorials. My advice is have a project in mind. For me, I wanted to create a project management software for client-side project managers. I was able to visualize how it should look like and work, as you can see in my sketch over there. So anything I learned going forward, I was thinking about how to apply it to my project. For example, when you create a model, I was thinking about, oh, I can have a construction project as a model with attributes like title, address, owner, etc. Or I should use UUID as primary keys for comments. So think about the industry you work in and think of a project which could make your life so much easier. Maybe it could also be profitable. Could it be something about reporting, your organization intranet? If you have a project in mind, you'll be able to apply the learnings directly. Tip number 4. Django official polls tutorial is hard. Try other tutorials first. For people who have just started learning Django, have you tried doing the official polls tutorial? For me, it took me 4 days to get through it. Django polls tutorial is more tailored towards intermediates. My advice is try off with tutorials which are actually written for beginners. There are a lot of tutorials out there, but here are a couple that I've tried. So Mozilla's Django tutorial, where you get to build a local library website, and I also bought an ebook called Django for Beginners by William Vincent. This book is really good because each tutorial is like a little project and you get to build very simple things like blogs and message boards. Tip number 5. Learn the tools and write down the commands. So you'll be spending a lot of time writing commands in your terminal. I highly recommend you to write down the commands line somewhere easily accessible so you don't forget. In order for you to use Django, you need to learn how to use basic terminal commands, at least learn how to change directories. You'll also be using heaps of Django commands and it will become almost second nature to you. Things like Python manage.py, start project, run project, create super user, etc. But when you're starting off, I suggest you to write these down. Virtual environment. So virtual environment is like putting all the packages you need to run your project into an environment. And if you don't set it up and activate it, the project will be using the packages you've installed in your computer. In a lot of tutorials, they highly recommend you to set up a virtual environment. And as a beginner, you might find it a little bit confusing. Like it seems a little bit unnecessary to activate the virtual environment every time you work on your project. And you might think that you might not need it because you're the only one working on the project. My advice is get familiar with virtual environments now because once you start sharing your project with others, it's going to be so important. Because virtual environments tells other people exactly what packages are required to run your project and then they can emulate this on their computer. And this becomes increasingly important if you start using third-party packages. For me, I'll probably never be able to remember the command line to activate the virtual environment, but I've written it down as you can see. I copy and paste it across to the terminal every time I want to activate the virtual environment. Following on, Git. Git is also a little bit confusing. Git is a version control system and you need to learn it in order for you to push it and pull it from GitHub. Check out this website summarizing some of the most important Git commands. And when you're using Git, don't forget to put git ignore file as well. Git ignore file specifies files and directories which shouldn't be committed, such as your installed packages. When I first started, I was experimenting with Node.js modules. I didn't have a git ignore files and I was committing everything to GitHub repository. And I was wondering whether it was really necessary to be committing hundreds of megabytes of modules into the repository. Turns out no, and you shouldn't. So yeah, check out GitHub's git ignore file that you can use for your Django and Python projects. And Django documentation. Django documentation is massive and can be intimidating. Don't you hate it when someone asks a question on Stack Overflow and people respond with, "Oh, just read the Django docs"? A lot of the time, these answers are a little bit unhelpful for beginners because despite reading the documentation several times, it's still very hard to understand. But sometimes the answer is actually clearly spelled out in Django documentation. My advice is figure out which pages in the documentation is actually useful, and I suggest you to check out a blog post by Matt Segal, who has written about how to read Django docs. Learn these tools, write down the command lines in your notes, and learn how to search for answers in the documentation. Tip number 6. Use a linter and a formatter. I wish someone told me this earlier, but did you know there is an automated way to format your code and check for style and programming errors? Before I was formatting HTML codes manually, tabs here and there, and then I discovered you can automatically do this. You can install packages on your text editor to style automatically and check for formatting errors for HTML, CSS, JS, Python codes. And also you can also set editor config files to say for HTML files put 2 spaces as indent, and for Python files put 4 spaces as indent. I was manually setting spaces preferences for each files for like 3 months until I discovered you can automatically do this. So if you are manually formatting your code, stop right now and look for solutions. It's going to make your life so much easier. I use Sublime Text, so if you're using that, check these links out. Tip number 7. Connect with web developers. I studied architecture, engineering, and I work in the building and construction industry, so I don't really have any web developer friends. Maybe this is the same for you too. So how to connect with web developers? I would start by asking your friends if they know of anyone who's a web developer. My high school friend recently introduced me to her boyfriend who's a web developer, and now I chat to him about web development. When I was traveling in Chile, I also met a guy from Reddit. He posted a website that he made, and it was a website about the town he was living in. I happened to come across this article and I was planning to visit that town anyway, so I messaged him saying, "Oh, I really like your website, it's really helpful. I'll be traveling there in a couple of days, do you want to meet up?" And we did. And we kept in contact ever since. And now I also chat to him about web development. I believe that people are more than willing to help you if you ask the right questions and want advice. Obviously, they're not going to do the work for you, but people are willing to help whenever they can. So if you personally don't know of any web developers, ask your friends if they know of anyone and connect with people online, maybe at this conference. Tip number 8. You can either choose to spend time or money. Now this really depends on your goal. For me, I work full-time and I'm a little bit time poor. My aim wasn't to become a master in Django, but to know enough Django to get started. At one stage, I was really stuck on things like related names and context data, and I worked on it for a few days and I still didn't get it. So I just decided to go on Upwork.com and pay someone to fix my problem. And for me, that was the best decision ever. Now I have a couple of developers that I pay to help me. My workflow goes something like this. So I try code something, and if it doesn't work, I give it to the developer, and then they fix it, and then I review the code and see how they did it. So check out Upwork.com if you're looking for freelancers. It might take a couple of tries to find a developer who meets your working style and your budget. So how I approached this was I first gave them a task for a fixed price, and if they did a great job, they provided good service, and I got along well with them, I hired them on an hourly basis with capped hours, and I sent them a list of tasks each week. Also, when you're working with freelancers, make sure to manage and set realistic expectations. So if it's the first time working with them, don't promise them that you'll be giving a lot of work in the future because things might change. And also give them enough time to actually work on the code. So the choice is yours. You can either choose to spend time or money. Tip number 9, keep learning. There are so many great resources out there to help you learn more about web development and Django. Twitter is not a thing in the Australian building and construction industry. But when I was checking out a lot of web development websites, I found out that everyone's active on Twitter, so I also got Twitter. And since then, I've been following many people and organizations in the web development space. I also bought 3 Scoops of Django. It's a very good book. It's aimed more towards experienced beginners to advanced people. It talks about best practices and the reasons why, and I highly recommend it. I've also been listening to Django Chat podcast. They discuss a whole range of things, from specific topics like URLs. They also interview people who contributes to the Django framework and people who uses Django professionally. There are a few blogs that I've found to be good and I follow. So Matt Lehman, Simply is Better Than Complex.com, Matt Segar. And I'm sure you know this already as you're listening to this presentation, but there are Django cons all around the world and there are great talks on YouTube. And so yeah, highly recommend you to check out YouTube. Last but not least, my final tip, number 10, keep it simple. If it's your first time building a web app, I would recommend just stick to Django and CSS framework like Bootstrap or Bulma. You might read things on Twitter like React, Vue, Angular, Next, Doc.js, Nux.js. Honestly, you'll most likely be able to just use Django and HTML and a CSS framework to create a project you have in mind. So instead of being swayed by all these new and shiny things you read about, just focus on your product. So this is where I am on my journey. I've been working very hard on my app called Consta. I paid a couple of developers to help me throughout the process. I started in April and now it's September, and I think I'll be able to launch for beta testing next month. I've used Django, Bulma CSS, and a lot of third-party packages. For my personal website, I switched from WordPress to Wagtail CMS, which is a Django content management system. It's a multi-site, so it hosts both my personal website, dearandrewkim.com, and also buildingproductivity.tech, which is a blog where I write about actionable productivity tips for building and construction industry. Yeah, using Wagtail CMS and actually deploying it, it's been a great experience, seeing it right from the beginning to the end because I could see the whole process. So in summary, the journey to web development is long but very well traveled. Django is a good choice. Have a project in mind. Try easier tutorials. Learn the tools and make notes. Use a linting and formatting tool. Connect with web developers. You can choose to spend either time or money. Keep learning and keep it simple. If you're from a different industry and want to take on the web development journey, I highly recommend it. Although it will be frustrating at first, you learn so much about the web, you'll encounter highly knowledgeable people and engage in many interesting conversations. And there are lots of resources out there to help you learn. And you'll have the skill to potentially create a profitable software for your industry. Thanks for listening, and I hope the tips I gave will be helpful for your journey.